Hi folks, Pat Healy here for the Laker News. We present to you our video interview series with some of the candidates running to be MP for Sackville, Bedford, Preston in the April 28th federal election. These video interviews were done with the goal of giving residents a better idea of what each stands for as we head to the polls. The video interview series is sponsored by Joanne Poulin of eXp Realty. Thanks, Joanne. Now let's check out the interviews. Hi, I'm here with Liberal candidate Braedon Clark. Give us a little bit of background about yourself.
Sure, Pat. So thank you for having me. I'm Braedon Clark. I'm the Liberal candidate here in Sackville, Bedford, Preston. I was born and raised in Bedford. Grew up in that area. I'm a journalist by training. Two young kids, 7 and 4. I was also an MLA, provincial representative for Bedford South between 2021 and 2024.
All right, let's get into the questions.
Yes.
Why did you want to put your name forward and run in the federal election?
That's a good question. Lots of people ask. I think the main reason is because, I've always believed in politics as a force for good, as a force for change. And I think this election, politicians always say this is the most important election, right? This time I think it's true, right? I think we're dealing with issues domestically in Canada and internationally as well that are really, really important. And so for somebody like me who really believes in politics and thinks it can be and should be a force for positive change, I think the opportunity to step up and run was too important, and so I decided to put my name on the ballot.
What are your top 3 priorities, if elected, for Sackville, Bedford, Preston?
Yeah, so I would say, and these things are all connected, of course, in some way, shape, or form, but housing's a big one, always. So I was also the housing critic for the provincial Liberal Party for 2.5 years. So that was a really important issue for me provincially. Again, if I'm lucky enough to be elected, it will be an important issue for me federally as well, because people across this riding and across the country, as we know, are dealing with unaffordable housing in a lot of places. So housing's one. Infrastructure is another one. So that can be everything from sewer and water to transit to highways. So and schools and hospitals, of course, as well. But how do we move people around? How do we make sure that an economy is functioning as well as it possibly can? And then general affordability. So whether that's prices at the grocery store, at the pumps. We just saw gas go down by 17 cents the other day, which is great. Middle-class tax cuts, those kinds of things, to make sure that people who are struggling with the high cost of living can get some relief. And I think that's what the Liberal Party is presenting in this campaign.
We all know buyers set the market prices for home sales. What will you do to create more affordable housing in our area, particularly in HRM, which has access to public transit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the federal government has a really important role to play when it comes to housing, in particular affordable housing. So the other day, you would have seen Prime Minister Carney make an announcement around creating a government entity called Build Canada Homes. And the idea there is to ramp up to a point where we're building 500,000 homes a year. And this is similar to an approach that was done after the Second World War, where the federal government was very involved in building affordable housing in particular. And a lot of those homes across HRM and across the country are still standing, still occupied, 80 years later. So the idea that the market can solve all the problems when it comes to housing, I don't think is accurate. I think that's a big part of it, the lion's share, but also the government, the provincial government, the federal government, and the municipalities have to work together. Otherwise, we're not going to deal with this challenge in a real sustained way and get people homes they can afford.
The next question is, what will you do to improve healthcare staffing that are not focused on only doctors and nurses?
Yeah, this is another big one. So again, this is one that, of course, during my time as an MLA, I would have dealt with a lot, because healthcare is 45% of the provincial budget. So I think it's a matter of 2 things. One is, how do you attract people from other parts of Canada to Nova Scotia to work in the healthcare system? And as you say, it's not just doctors and nurses. It's physios. It's everybody who's involved in that allied healthcare professional, continuing care assistants, for example. So how do we get people from other parts of Canada? And secondly, how do we identify, recruit, and bring people from other parts of the world who have the skills and the jobs that we're looking for, and make sure that we can attract and retain them, right? That's the important part. Somebody comes here, If they move after 9 months, that's a lot of effort that didn't result in what we wanted. So two pieces: how do we attract people, and how do we retain people from across Canada and across the world?
How would you advocate for local businesses that may be impacted by tariffs put on Canadian goods by U.S. President Donald Trump?
Yeah, so I was just actually the other day, I was knocking on doors in Bedford and talking to a friend of mine who I grew up with and his parents. And he owns and operates a business in Burnside, which is part of the riding actually. And it's in the packaging space. And he's really concerned about tariffs because he, like many businesses, the majority of his exports go to the U.S. So I think the number one question or issue that I'm hearing at the doors from people is, who do you want as the Prime Minister of Canada to deal with President Trump, who's obviously an unpredictable person to deal with. There's no question about that. And the response has been very clear, very decisive. I think people want Prime Minister Carney. I think we just saw the other day that the tariffs that were imposed on April 2nd were not as punishing as we feared. Still unacceptable, but I think Prime Minister Carney is clearly the best person to deal with President Trump, and that would help all businesses across Canada and those here in Sackville, Bedford, Preston as well.
Would a federal Liberal government consider funding sewer systems in areas that are currently in septic so more housing could be created?
Yeah, this is, the short answer to that is yes. I think we would never say no to looking at it. I know this is a big issue, for example, in Fall River. In 2017, I helped Bill Horn, who was the MLA out there at the time, in his re-election campaign and going door to door out in Fall River. You'd often hear about water, right? We're on well, we're worried about that. We need city water extended here. And that's something that the federal government over the last 10 years, I think, has done a really good job in expanding through investing in Canada infrastructure, sewer and water systems. But I think we need to keep working on that to make sure that people have access to the services that they need and that development can happen, which of course also has a benefit when it comes to housing, which we talked about earlier too.
There's a need for affordable housing, and that includes homes with accessibility. Mm-hmm. How would you ensure that housing is accessible friendly?
Yeah, and this is one where I think the role of the government is clear. So when the government's involved in a project, there should be absolutely no question that that project should be fully and completely accessible, right? And I know the province of Nova Scotia has an Accessibility Act and is required to be accessible by 2030. It's a big task, but it's one that we need to get behind as a province and as a country to make sure that no matter who you are, you have a place where you can live that's safe and comfortable for you. So I think, as I said earlier, if the federal government is involved in building new affordable housing, that affordable housing will also be accessible, and that's a huge thing for people in Nova Scotia, because Nova Scotia has the highest rate of people with disabilities in Canada. So particularly in our province, it's an issue that we need to address.
All right. And the last question is, in some areas of Sackville, Bedford, Preston, cell coverage is a problem affecting residents, businesses, but more importantly, home-based businesses. Mm-hmm. How would you work with your prospective government members to improve this?
Yeah, this is a big one too. Cell coverage, rural broadband, for example, those have been big issues over the last number of years. And one of the benefits, I think, of my candidacy here is that having provincial experience will help me work with the current MLAs in this area, all of whom I know personally, or the municipal councillors as well, many of whom I know, to make sure that all three levels of government work together, right? And I think people, general voters, can get upset because they think government doesn't work, and they're often right. Government doesn't work as quickly or as efficiently as it can, and often that's because, the province isn't talking to the feds and the feds aren't talking to the city. So one of the things that I want to do, if I am elected as the Member of Parliament, is to make sure that all three levels are rowing in the same direction, so that things like cell coverage, which is good for business, is essential for safety, right? If, God forbid, if we're dealing with a wildfire or something of that nature again, and people don't have access to cell coverage, that could be, a life or death type situation. So expanding that, working with the other levels of government is something that I think I'd be well positioned to do, and I think it's essential.
Thank you very much for taking some time on a busy campaign day to take some questions from us. We want to thank each of our candidates for taking the time out of their campaigning to take questions from us. There's never been a more crucial time to have your say and vote than right now. Advance voting is open April 18th to 21st from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. The federal election will be held on April 28th. Thank you to Joanne Poulin of eXp Realty for sponsoring these video interviews. Pat Healy for the Laker News in Lower Sackville.